started. Janet, any questions before we let her just go on with her story? Because I'm sure everybody's going to want to read the book. But we need to let her sort of give whatever information she wants to give. What do you think, Janet?
Well,
you ready,
I
or
would like
what do you want to do?
break it down a little bit into sections, and of course, whatever you want to do, you're the lead interviewer here. This is your show, and I'm your co-host. But I'm fascinated with the Amish. I visit them every summer for I was married for about 10 years to my second husband, who lived in Pennsylvania. We went down to Lancaster. We would go there because it was for me, it was like traveling back in time. And there was a part of me that was wondering, how would we survive if our whole system collapsed? This was pre, what do they call those people that prepare for disasters? But I had happened upon a book called The Late Great Planet. Preppers. This was pre-preppers. And I happened upon a book called The Late Great Planet Earth, and I read it because at that time I was trying to prove to the world that I can read even a strong Christian book and still have my beliefs, and so because they challenged me and said, well, how do you know? So this was Hal Lindsey, an evangelist, and they read it, and it was Revelations, and it kind of described what would happen after this apocalypso. This apocalyptic event, and we would be basically rendered back to the Stone Age, and we wouldn't have electricity. And so I used to go study the Amish. It's like, well, how do they do it? How can they, they feed themselves, and they seem to have happy, wholesome lives. And, of course, as the outsider, I didn't know the internal politics. I think I even had to go to and you can verify this for me, Torah. Do they ever have open, church things? I remember there was some kind of thing we went to that was open to the English, was outside, and it was some kind of, I don't know what it was. They were singing. They were singing spiritual songs. It could have been some kind of church service or something. But anyway, I remember we got to see it. It wasn't commercialized like the restaurants, and they said eat Amish style, and you could sit there and a group table, and yada. So anyway, I was fascinated, and I didn't realize why I was fascinated until I kind of thought about it, and then I remembered, because back in the 70s I read about the late great planet Earth, and I was curious how the world would adapt, and the Amish seemed to never skip a beat because they never went into the world of technology, so they weren't really programmed to use technology. They knew how to raise enough food to feed themselves with just an animal pulling. Getting feedback again. Pulling some kind of manual equipment, and they did have some things with motors. I don't know. I was very confused. So I guess my first question is, you were saying in the last show that there are various types of Amish, and they have varying levels of technology. I didn't know the Amish I was looking at, they didn't have buttons, but they were allowed to have straight pins or something like that. And
they didn't even have buttons?
Little,
are you sure? Wow.
Yeah, I remember I was shocked that there's no buttons. There's no buttons. And maybe it wasn't all of them, but I hadn't really noticed, and then I go, how are they holding their clothes there? I thought pins would be awkward because you'd eventually stick yourself. Anyway, and then let's see what else do I remember. The ones that I was observing and hanging out with had kind of they were allowed to have bright-colored shirts. The men had to or bolder color shirts. They didn't use pastels. They were solid colors. And I'm trying to remember what the women wore. But I don't
probably
think they were all
color,
one color.
Gray, pale blue. The guys, and she can get into this, folks. We're going to let Torah get into all this because she briefly mentioned it last time. But now our guys in Kentucky wore jeans made from denim jean, but they sure didn't look like the kind you bought in the store. The pockets were different. They wore suspenders, and they had a blue, I don't know if you call it royal blue, strange color blue. And the women all wore something, I don't know what you'd call it, but they had more than, you talked about Torah the cap. So I guess we're going to start with how we see them with our eyes and why the different communities wear different colors, Torah, if you don't mind.
Sure. So within the Amish, there's a range from very conservative to more modern or liberal, and by that I mean they're in terms of material possessions or what they allow in terms of technology. It ranges from very conservative to more modern. The conservative end of the Old Order Amish, so I'm only speaking about Old Order Amish. Now, there's also such a thing as Schwarzenegger Amish, Swiss Amish, New Order Amish, Beachy Amish, Amish Mennonite. We won't go into any of those. The Old Order Amish are what are the original Amish in terms of when they broke away from the Mennonites in the 1600s. And how you can tell the difference as an insider, as a member of the Amish, someone who's born and raised, is by looking at their style or of dress, or their basically Amish fashion. What kind of fashion are they wearing? Like what colors are they wearing, and what's the style or patterning of their clothes? So, for example, the brighter the colors are, the more modern that person is. And the ones on the very conservative end normally do not allow bright colors. You will see them wearing dark blue, maybe royal blue, might be the brightest color, lots of grays and dark greens maybe. And in terms of grays, I don't think they might not even allow gray. So it'd be brown, dark brown. For some reason, gray is a color that isn't allowed. I don't know the answer as to why. That's just one of the things. But you'll see a lot of browns, dark blues, and maybe dark green. That depends on the community. And then you'll also, in terms of buttons, as Janet had mentioned, the women are not allowed to have buttons. They fasten everything with straight pins, like sewing pin or a tailor's pins, how a traditional tailor would what they would use when they're making clothes. And the men, however, on the other hand, are allowed to use buttons, although certain types of Amish on the very strict end won't allow that either for the men. They will have to use what's called hooks and eyes. And I don't know what that is, how to explain that. If you're not familiar with the term, just look it up, Google it, and there should be pictures or an explanation. In no case are you allowed to have zippers, neither the men nor the women. Now, in terms of buttons for the women on the more modern end, I don't know that that's allowed either. I've never seen that myself, but I'm not the authority to talk about that, because I was raised in a small community from a range of very conservative to modern, but we weren't allowed to have buttons as women. So that's not saying that in the big communities that the women may not be allowed to have buttons instead of straight pins. I just don't know for sure. And another thing that defines the more modern Amish from the more conservative is that the modern ones will be allowed to have, depending on the community, because every community has different rules. Some will allow you to have bikes and gas, propane-powered stoves and propane-powered refrigerators in the house and indoor bathrooms. And then you can go from, sort of a more strict community, downgrade, to being allowed to have indoor bathrooms but no propane-powered refrigerators and stoves, which is what my paternal grandparents had at one point. And then a further downgrade would be where you're not allowed to even have running hot water, but you could have running cold water. So that's the range that we're talking about. Questions so far?
Yeah, Torah, who makes these decisions? And I mean, how do the men not stick themselves? How does anybody not stick themselves? Especially, I mean, that seems like a delicate place to be dealing with pins, especially as a man.
Well, so for pins, is that the question, Janet? How you don't stick yourself with pins?
Yeah. I have two parts. Who makes up these rules?
Uh-huh.
Is this like a book that's written, or who makes up these rules? And do they ever change the rules? Do they say, I think it's time we move to buttons? And and then the second part was, I was just envisioning the pin thing, having to deal with the pin thing, and I thought that would be really hard not to stick yourself.
Yeah. So I'm going to answer
that goes back.
I'm going to mute again. I'll mute. Go ahead.
Okay. So I'll answer the pins question first. How do you not stick yourself with the pins? Well, that's impossible in the beginning, at least in my experience. When you turn 10, and this is generally speaking in terms of the rules of whatever church you come from, usually, it's age 10, it could be a little bit older or perhaps even younger. But at age 10, the girls switch their dress pattern from buttoning up in behind on the back side to having to be closed up in front with straight pins. And that is, in the beginning, to learn how to wear straight pins. That's a skill that you have to learn. The buttons or the pins used to fall out all the time. I would be cooking or baking something, and I'd have to constantly keep an eye on the pins to make sure that they didn't fall into the cookie dough, for example. And eventually, you just learn how to wear the straight pins, and that doesn't mean that you won't ever lose a straight pin, but it does get easier. So I don't really know how to explain it other than maybe it's similar to learning how to wear heels. It's something that you have to practice, and eventually you can walk in, 4-inch heels. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Mm-hmm. Do they have those pins on baby clothes? And how do babies not end up, sticking themselves?
The babies don't wear straight pins, so they wear buttons or hooks and eyes, depending on the community. Their clothes are fastened with buttons or hooks and eyes. It's only the women who wear straight pins, and only from age 10 onwards, or it might be a little bit older, depending on the community's rules. That's when they determine that the girl is now becoming a woman. She's going through puberty. Now it's time for her to change her dress, her fashion, from being buttoned up through the back to being buttoned up through the front with straight pins.
Okay, well,
I'm
what about Anabaptist?
Minimizing noise. So, CJ, you take it for a while, because it seems to be when I go on, I get feedback. So I'm going to mute. Okay, go ahead, TJ.
Yeah, that's real interesting, Jan. We haven't had that for years. But you didn't call in on a computer. Janet, I know you called in on your phone, I guess. And I called in on my phone, and so
yes, but now
it may be because
you're echoing.
Yeah,
you have your sound up on your computer. I'm going to mute because it makes it worse when I'm unmuted.
Yeah, no, I'm on my phone, so not sure what's going on. All right, so these are Amish, Mennonites, and Quakers began their origins in the old country, folks. They're all based on the Christian Protestant faith, but they broke off from Germany, Switzerland, and then later on, I guess the Quakers were England. But